So yeah, I'm Marcus from Wild New Forest, and yeah, I'm going to be talking tonight about the Lymington Key Haven marshes, kind of the importance of the marshes, really, and some of the wildlife we get there, and the potential impacts of disturbance. We'll kind of look at all that together. But first of all, the first part of the talk is I'm just going to talk about the marshes and why it's such an important place for wildlife. So first of all, just a very quick little bit about us. We're Wild New Forest Guided Tours, so we are a not-for-profit company that does tours across the forest, and we do a lot of research and field work with a number of the species across the forest. So the funds that are generated from the tours we put back into the field work. So it's just as a heads up, that's a little bit about who we are. Also, I should say this is chunky. So I'm coming at this as a dog owner and somebody who regularly takes my dog out on the marshes. So I understand the challenges and the complicated situation that we have with the sort of balancing nature and wildlife and recreation in the forest. Recreation is all important, and so I just wanted to put it out there that I don't often get a chance to put chunky in talks, so this is chunky. He's a soppy, soft thing. Um, right, so the marshes. So I'm going to be talking about Lymington Key Haven marshes. I don't know if you can see my cursor on the screen, but it's down there. Just to put some context, I think we all know on this call where the marshes are between Lymington and Key Haven. And this is a map of the area that we're talking about. But really, as part of my talk, I'm also including Hurst Spit and Hurst Castle because that's an equally important area for wildlife. And it really is a vitally important area for a whole mix of wildlife. But we'll be focusing mainly today on birds, but it is a whole range of wildlife that is important for. One of the reasons it's so important is because of where we are. So I've got these don't come out very clearly. I just pinched these off the internet, but I wanted to highlight just how important our area is for wildlife. And so we've got a couple of maps here showing wetlands and areas of salt marsh along the south coast. And the long and short of it is there isn't very much, but you can see in our region, along the New Forest coast, there's a big section, and it is a really important area for wildlife. It's sort of one of those rare sort of oases, especially for a lot of birds are long distance migrants. They move long distances. They move around a lot. And the south coast of the UK now is so heavily developed that there are very few options for birds that are moving along the south coast. And through the English Channel is a really important flyway. They don't have that many options, but one of the probably the most important is in our neck of the woods. So that stretch really from Poole Harbour up to Southampton Water is really important, and therefore we get a large concentration of birds relying heavily on this habitat that we have here. So, what I'm going to talk about, first of all, I'm going to talk about a bit about the marsh and what it is, why it's important, the features that make it important, and then some of the characters that we see on the marsh. And then we'll talk a bit more about what we can do to keep it the important place it is. So, I mean, first of all, the Lymington Key Haven marshes are really heavily designated an internationally important wildlife site. It's a Ramsar site, a Triple S site, an SPA, and a national nature reserve. So that's about as heavily protected as an area as you can get in this country. And that's in recognition of the wildlife. And all of these designations, they're not just given, there has to be a valid reason for these designations to be appointed. And a lot of it is bird orientated with the marshes, but also there's invertebrates. It's important also for mammals and reptiles. So it's a very important place. It has quite confusing management, so it's managed by the Countryside Service, Hampshire County Council Countryside Service. That's the bit that generally we're on, is managed by the Countryside Service. So that's the sea wall and inside the sea wall. But then offshore is actually managed by the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. So it's two different organisations, but they work fairly seamlessly together. And then, for our part at Wild New Forest, we do a fair bit of field work on the marshes. So we supply a lot of data that gets used about, the aspects of wildlife on the marshes. So what makes it important? Well, it's as it says here, home to over 250 species of birds, including overwintering breeding populations, also passage populations, migratory birds. We're lucky to have a lot of rare species that are nesting here, such as the avocet and the marsh harrier. That's two. That's just the tip of an iceberg. That's a long list of species that is very special for. But it's not, we all sort of default towards the birds because the birds are visible. The birds are kind of obvious. We're walking along, we see the birds as we're going about. But there's much more to it. As it says there, it's a nursery ground for fish, but also incredibly important for invertebrates. And for the birds to be there, there's got to be food to sustain them, and generally that's the small fish and invertebrates. It's a really important site for that. But also above and beyond that, as it says there, carbon capture and flood protection. So it serves a really important role. Not least, as somebody who's a naturalist and into the science of things, you tend to get sort of engrossed in all of the science side of it. But not least, it's just a beautiful place. It's a wonderful place. It's a place that many of us can go and enjoy. And we've all got different things that we take out of it, but at the end of the day, it's still a very important place to each and every one of us for different reasons. So, what makes it important for the birds, for the wildlife? And so I thought I'd focus on three things because there are three broad areas: there's wintering, passage birds, and breeding. So starting off with the wintering birds, is not just one thing. What makes it so important is it's a mix of very important habitats. There's the intertidal, as we call it, which is basically the mud at low tide. It's full of life, full of worms, full of invertebrates, and mollusks and all sorts of things that the birds can feed on. But what they need, as well as that, is somewhere safe to roost. So obviously the tide comes and goes. High tide, we've got that area inside the seawall, the lagoons, which are a safe haven for them to move to over the high tide period. But also beyond that, an area that we don't sort of tend to explore all that much is inside the seawall. Along the back, we've got the paddocks and the field systems, which are also really important for some of the species like the brent geese. Without those three habitats together, we wouldn't have the brent geese. So all three are as important as each other. And it's important that they're quiet, undisturbed places that birds can go and feed, especially during the winter months when the days are so short. Most of these species have quite fast metabolisms, so they need to be constantly feeding. And a bird such as a dunlin, if it missed a day's feeding, it wouldn't have enough sustenance to survive the night. So it's quite crucial for these birds to be able to sustain themselves. Um, as I say there, it's nationally important or internationally important for curlew and brent goose, but also a whole range of wildfowl and waders, and other species. Um, so some of the species here, it's a long list of species that the marshes are famous for. I won't read through them all. We can all see what's on there, but it's above and beyond what we'd expect. I mentioned brent goose, I mentioned curlew because they're kind of like headline species, but there's other things as well. And this little picture in the bottom right corner kind of exemplifies it a little bit. Doesn't look like much. It's hard to get a good picture of, but this was on a day about 10 years ago when it snowed, and it snowed quite heavily inland. It's always a bit milder at the coast, and so we had this amazing arrival of birds. And so with these birds in the field here are fieldfare and redwing. We had about 5,000 redwing turn up, a couple of thousand fieldfare, all reliant. This is all squeezed into this one spot. This is a little safe haven for a few days for these birds. It's a magical few days, and we get this once every few years. This arrival of winter birds when we get a cold snap. We had one recently where we had a good arrival of birds. So it's not just the wildfowl and the waders. It's an important site for a whole wealth of different species. Okay, so that takes us on to passage birds. So that's our wintering birds. That's the birds that are there, either sedentary birds that are there year round, or birds that come and spend the winter with us. And let's not forget they're coming from a long way to spend the winter with us. But it's also important for passage birds. So where we are geographically in Europe is a really important migration route. So the English Channel is a big flyway, as they call it. Birds moving between Northern Europe and Central Southern Europe and Africa, they all pass through the English Channel. And so those birds that are moving along our side of the English Channel, there aren't that many places for them to stop off. So the marshes are really important, and that shows itself in April, May, June, and then again in September and October when we have these thousands upon thousands of birds stopping off to feed. And without these stop-off points, they're being in a lot of trouble. And a good example of that is actually a bird we had. I should have put a picture on it actually. A bird that we had a few years ago, a little stint, which is a tiny little bird, the size of a sparrow. It's a wading bird, and it was colour ringed. I always remember it because when we put rings on birds, we have little codes on the rings, and this one, its code was sex for sex. So yeah, why they chose to put that on, I don't know. But that bird was ringed in Norway. The amazing thing was it was ringed in Norway 2 days previously. And so that little wading bird, it was a juvenile, so it was only literally a few weeks old, had flown on its own from northern Norway to Normandy Marsh in 2 days, in 997 kilometers, we measured it as. And then, remarkably, just a couple of weeks later, it was recorded again off the west coast of Africa in Senegal. So, these are really important stop-off points. If birds like this couldn't have these stop-off refueling points along the way, then it would cause, it could certainly have a big impact on their populations. So yes, sorry, I'm prattling, but it's an important trying to make the point. It's an important important waypoint for passage birds. They're all concentrated into these small spots along the coast, and so some of the species listed here, bar and black-tailed godwit, be good examples. And again, Brent geese. We have the Brent geese come and spend the winter with us, but a lot of them also just passing through. But it's not just the waders and the wildfowl. It's passerines there, which are like the perching birds, chats, warblers, finches. Terns and skewers, swallows. It's important sites for all of these birds. And then really the main thing is our breeding birds. And so it's a fantastic spot for breeding birds. In fact, it is probably recognised now as one of the most important sites in the southern UK. And especially now with the association with the New Forest, the mix and assemblage of species, the biodiversity we have here is phenomenal. I mean, we're so lucky to be living in such a biodiverse space, probably one of the most biodiverse spaces in Europe, in fact, which is remarkable to think, where we're squeezed into the central southern UK, sandwiched between Southampton and Bournemouth, and we've got this wonderful area for wildlife. So it's nationally important for the species like avocets and terns and gulls. But what's really important for all of these is they have this environment to nest in. And again, all of these, we could pick them all out individually, but we'd be here all night. But all of these birds, they have specific requirements, and their requirements are essentially to have a quiet and peaceful nest site, but also they need to obviously feed. They need to have a source of food, so they can't just nest anywhere. They're all very particular in their, even down to the substrate that they nest on. So little terns will only nest on shingle, which puts them at odds with us humans because they like to nest on shingle beaches, which are obviously quite busy places in the summer. And so these places, such as the marshes, they're nesting on the islands and all across the marshes, are really vitally important for some of these birds. So I keep on pressing my down button on my keyboard, but just the mouse is operating this. So breeding birds, we have a long list of breeding birds. We can all read that. Again, there's some unexpected species there. You may not expect to be nesting on the marshes. Stuff like peregrine. So it's an important place for warblers. It's an important place for terns and gulls, and even things right down to water rail, which is quite a rare bird across the UK. And so there's a whole mix of species, and that represents the mix of habitats and environments that we've got on the marshes. So when I was putting this talk together, it's difficult to think about what to do and how to present it. But what I wanted to do is just sort of show some of the characters that we're likely to meet out on the marsh. So I think a big part of taking care of our environment is understanding our environment and having a connection with the species that are within it. And so I just wanted to introduce some of the characters that we might see when you're out and about on the seawall walking around. that you might come across. The first of these is one that is present across the marshes at the moment, the good old Brent goose. So the Brent geese, they have quite a tough life. They're quite a long-lived bird, the Brent goose, and they're travelling down to us to spend the winter with us from Siberia. So they nest on the Siberian tundra. So they've got an awful long journey to get to us. They do it relatively quickly, but it's quite a treacherous journey. So the Brent goose is protected in the UK, but not across the whole of its journey is it protected. So they are a target for hunters along the way. So and birds of prey and all sorts of things. So it's a treacherous journey to get here. But they have very specific requirements. The Brent goose, they eat grass essentially, grass and seaweeds. They prefer eel grass. So when they get here, our areas that we have, such as the salt marshes, are really important to them. So the grasses that are available to them on the salt marshes. But of course, at high tide, particularly on the high spring tides, those salt marshes get covered up, and so the geese have to move inland. And you can get very familiar with Brent geese because they're ever present through the winter months, and so you get to maybe even a little bit blasé about them, but they're actually not a common bird. Essentially, we've got large numbers wintering in our area, but they are a sensitive species. Even though we see them quite frequently from the seawall, they're a sensitive species, and so when they get pushed off of the salt marshes at high tide, they go and feed on the inland fields. So along the back lanes, along the back of the marsh, they go and graze on the grass in the fields, and that's where they're a little bit more vulnerable, and particularly vulnerable to disturbance. And they're sensitive birds, so if they get disturbed too many times, they'll just stop using an area. And what we have in our area, we don't have that much for them. We don't have that much habitat for them. We've got the salt marshes, we've got the grasslands, but it's important for them that they get just basically the peace and quiet that they need. Like I say, they're quite sensitive to disturbance. And grass isn't the most nutritious of diets, so they need to eat rather a large amount of it to sustain themselves. Every year we keep an eye on our Brent geese, so we do a fair bit of work with Brent geese, and it's always a thing looking at the family parties because they're very endearing. They come back in family parties of 4 or 5 from Siberia. They travel together, come and spend the winter here. Sadly, this year it seems to be a fairly unsuccessful one. There's very few juveniles across the marshes this year, so they've had a tough breeding season up in Siberia, largely down to lemmings. So it's been a good lemming year. So the chicks would have been heavily predated by lemmings out on their nest sites. So it would have been quite a stressful summer for them. And yeah, so they've come to spend the time with us, and so they're a gregarious species. They're very entertaining to watch. You kind of take them for granted a little bit, but if you're walking along, you'll quite often see them coming onto the lagoons, particularly Normandy Lagoon, sometimes Fishtail Lagoon. They'll come on to bathe because they're out there on the salt marsh, feeding on the grasses. They're getting whipped by the tide. They're getting salty. They don't like getting salty. It affects their waterproofing on their feathers, so they like to come and bathe quite frequently. They have little favourite spots they like to come and bathe in, so they can be quite entertaining to watch. For a gregarious flocking species, they're always getting quite shirty with one another. They're all got different characters. They're lovely birds, Brent geese. And so this is, I'll just play their call. I'm sure we're all well aware of it. The whole thing, so it goes on for a while, but just that for me, that is winter. That's just winter. This lovely little bubbling call that they have. So anyway, that's our first character, Brent geese. A good one to keep an eye out for. Our second, not so easy, but is Dunlin. So Dunlin is another bird that comes from the far north to spend the winter with us. Now, Dunlin do breed in the UK. We've got a small population of Dunlin breeding up in Scotland. But our Dunlin that spend the winter with us are coming from further away than that. So northern Scandinavia, they're coming from to spend the winter with us. So they're traveling, I guess, about 1,000, 1,200 kilometers to come and spend the winter with us. The reason I put Dunlin on is because they're one of our most numerous wading birds that we see. So the Dunlin are Yeah, it's always hard from this picture I've got on the slide here, but they're our smallest. Well, they're not really our smallest, but amongst the crop of small waders that we see flocks of. We have up to about 4,000 of them spending the winter with us. Um, they can form these amazing murmurations, but they have a tough existence. They have a really fast metabolism, so they'll go off feed at low tide. Like a lot of these birds, they don't live their life in a day-night cycle like we do. They live their life around the tides. So they're active at low tide, they roost at high tide. And so at low tide, they'll go off and feed on the intertidal, getting small invertebrates out of the mud. They've got like a little not chain, I was going to say chainsaw, sewing machine, like a little sewing machine action. They're constantly thumbing away, and they get impacted quite heavily by disturbance. But also when we have periods of frozen weather, and if the intertidal areas get hard to access, we've had many years when dunlin have had a hard time, and we find dead or dying dunlin in large numbers along the sea wall, unfortunately, because, as I say, they have a fast metabolism, and they need to eat almost constantly all day in order to survive those periods when they're not eating. Um, they again, another reasonably long-lived species, and quite entertaining to watch. And they're always a bird watcher's favourite, the dunlin. You'll see the bird watchers out looking at them on the seawall, because it's often when we have a rare bird or an unusual bird, they latch onto the dunlin flocks. So you get a lot of people looking through the dunlin flocks. But you'll often maybe find ring plovers, or if you're lucky, maybe like a curlew sandpiper or something in amongst the dunlin flock. But always entertaining to watch. So that's the dunlin. Um, Now my favourite. Now this isn't a common bird, but it's a bird that is actually quite special for the marshes. This is a spotted redshank. I had to put it in because it's almost like my favourite bird, really. But we have at the moment, I think there's about four of them on the reserve, which is quite low. Some years we have up to about 12, and we have up to about 10% of the UK population of spotted redshank on the marshes. So it's not a numerous bird anywhere. It's got quite low density. It's a bird that breeds again up in the top of Northern Europe. Um, but they have very particular requirements. So they feed in the water. They're looking for invertebrates in the water column. Um, so they use their eyes. So they're out in the water picking around, but they're very specific about where they can go, because they have to be in a sheltered area. As soon as there's a ripple on the water from the wind, they can't feed, because they can't see through the water to look for their prey. So that limits them to just one or two places on the marshes, and those places are so very important. And so if one of those places gets a bit of disturbance, that's it for the spotted redshanks. The other places are a closed door for them, because they can't go and feed there, because they're not capable of seeing their prey. And so it's really quite important. Particularly, it's the important area for spotted redshanks is Normandy Lagoon, Sultan's Lagoon, and a few of the lagoons around Oxley is sort of like their favoured bit, because they're more sheltered and they can feed there a bit more happily. But they're funny little characters as well. They're very entertaining to watch. They all hang out together. But as soon as one catches something interesting, because they're often catching little inverts, sort of shrimps and things. But every now and then one will get lucky and catch a fish, and it'll go off and hide somewhere to eat it, so it doesn't draw any attention to itself from the other spotted redshanks. Before they leave, so they're here until May. Before they leave, they molt into this beautiful plumage, and so in this image here, it's hard to see why they'd be called a spotted redshank, but when they go into their breeding plumage, they go all black, completely sort of jet black, with spangly silver dots across their back. Really beautiful, quite different to how they look in this picture here. And that's how they get their name, spotted redshank. But we only normally see them in that plumage for maybe a week a year, and then they're gone. But numbers have declined a lot in recent years for spotted redshank, so it's a species of concern for us. They have a lovely call, very distinctive call. I'll play it. There you go. And so they only really utter that when they're flying around, often when they've been moved on. So that's one to keep an ear out for. Okay. So next, another favourite of mine, the little tern. And now this is one of the jewels of the reserve, really, the tern. So we've been talking up till now about wintering birds. This is a summer bird, and so the little terns are here with us from sort of mid-April to mid-September, sometimes into early October. Um, and yeah, they are quite a scarce bird in the UK, as it says there are 1,400 pairs we've got. We've got 15 pairs on the reserve this year. That's down. We have had years where we've had 40 or 50 pairs of little terns. So the numbers have decreased. Numbers are decreasing nationally. But they're a wonderful species, very characterful. They're all each seems to be have its own character. They come to us from the west coast of Africa. We're doing a bit of work with little terns at the moment. You can see the picture at the bottom there is a juvenile little tern that we colour ringed. With the onset of climate change and changes to some of their nest sites across the UK, we're colour ringing. We're working with the RSPB to colour ring these terns to look at a mixture of things: longevity, breeding site fidelity, and migration routes to better understand them. Really, they're a Schedule 1 protected species, and so that means they've got the highest level of protection for any bird. You have to have a special license to go anywhere near them during the breeding season. But they're a little bit daft. They don't choose the best places to nest, even when there's lots of opportunity for them. And so, um, on the Lymington Keyhaven marshes, we get them nesting across the marshes. But they often try to settle in places like Hurst Spit, which are obviously vulnerable to an awful lot of disturbance, and that they're very sensitive to that disturbance. So generally they don't succeed. So that's something that we need to look at in future years, and it's part of an ongoing project. I'll play their call. There you go. There you go. Common tern in the background. But yeah, I guess it's not the most attractive, of course, but it's really catches your ear. And this is a bird also that's nesting. It's very specific. It needs to nest on shingle. It's vulnerable to birds of prey as well as disturbance. But it also has to feed, and this is like the spotted redshank, feeds with its eyes. And so this is one of the birds that you see as you're walking around the sea wall that will feed along the sea wall. So it'll take areas where the water is sheltered. So on the little ditches along the seawall that have small fish, or if there's a sheltered bit, the seawall's creating a bit of shelter from the wind, you'll see them really in close. So they're quite bold birds. They're only really sensitive when they're actually sat on the nest. But yeah, one we've got to be wary of. So that's a little tern. Next, we have the skylark. Now, I wanted to include the skylark because the marshes are really important for a whole host of ground nesting the small birds. But the skylark's kind of iconic. They're nesting all across the marshes, except numbers have declined hugely in recent years, and we think probably one of the reasons they've declined is disturbance because they're quite vulnerable. They're really hard to spot. They're hard to find the nests. Um, but if flushed, then they'll be off and not come back for quite some time. But they're an iconic British bird. That beautiful song they've got, and you can hear them from mid-Feb onwards. And like I say, they nest all across the marsh. One of the old hotspots was Oxley Marsh. We used to have a huge number of skylarks nesting out there, but in recent years, I think we've gone down to about two pairs. And that's the trouble um, sadly is disturbance. They have limited requirements. They just need a bit of peace and quiet. They need food to be available for them. So they eat invertebrate prey. And a bit of shelter, and that's pretty much all the boxes ticked for skylark. And so they rely heavily on their camouflage, which is partly what makes them a little bit vulnerable. Because a lot of birds will flash at quite some distance and move off, but skylarks tend to sit tight, which and flash at the last minute, which often gives away where their nest is. Um, I'll play their song. I'm sure we all know it. It's always a special day when you first start hearing them singing in the spring. Um, and you can often see them, funny enough, they a bit like house sparrows, they like to dust bathe. And so you can often see them actually, if you're lucky enough, if it's a quiet day and you're walking along the seawall, they like to go and land on the seawall and dust bathe to get rid of mites and parasites. Um, and they can be quite fun to watch when they're doing that. Um, right, next, ringed plover. So ringed plover, I put ringed plover on because this is a species that's received a lot of attention as part of a lot of work on the marsh at the moment. So and the thing is, we get involved in these projects with birds like this, but then for us, it's all 24/7. You're thinking about ringed plovers. But then you come to realize actually probably not that much is being put out into the public domain about them. And so I just wanted to highlight ring plovers. So they're a bird, again, like the little tern, that likes to nest on shingle. And so they've had a tough time in the UK, particularly the south coast of the UK, where numbers have declined hugely. So we've crashed down to 30 to 40 pairs in Hampshire, where, it's sort of, we're probably at about 20% of what we once had. Um, so they're having a tough time, ringed plovers. So there's a lot of work, a lot of focus on ringed plover, and they nest all across the reserve. They nest on the islands, on the lagoons. But one of the hot spots for ringed plover is along Hurst Beach and up towards Hurst Castle, and that's what's become apparent in recent years is they've been trying to nest there every year, in good numbers. But I don't think we've had a successful one there for some time. I've got a feeling maybe one chick came off this year, but they're having a tough time. They're an endearing bird. They're quite unobtrusive in some ways, so you often don't notice them. And what they do, if you're out and about, they do this lovely thing called a distraction display. So when they're nesting, the adults will feign an injury because they'll see any particular a walker or a cyclist or whatever coming nearby as a potential predator, and so they'll put on this injury display. And so they'll pretend they've got a broken wing and then walk away from the nest to try and distract the potential predator from the nest. And then at the last minute, they'll fly off. They're quite shirty birds as well. So they nest on across the marsh, but they're very what's the word? Very territorial, particularly when there's other small birds around, in particular little ringed plovers and other birds, other small waders. They end up getting in a lot of scraps with, so they can be quite entertaining to watch doing that. Picture at the bottom isn't actually one of my pictures, is a picture of a juvenile ringed plover. So we've had a reasonably good year this year with ring plovers, and what you might see as you go around the marshes, there's little cages on the islands. And so what's happening now with the ring plovers is to give them a bit of a head start, because they're not only just vulnerable to disturbance, they're vulnerable to predators as well. And so to give them a bit of a head start when they nest, we're going out and putting or the reserve staff are going out and putting a little cage over the nest. So the gauge of the cage is enough for the ring plover to come and go, but it prevents foxes, gulls, and other potential predators from getting at the eggs. So it gives them a bit of a head start. Unfortunately, as soon as the young hatch, the young run around. It's like herding cats for the adults, and so then they become vulnerable again. But at least it gives them a head start. And one of the projects we're looking at doing next year is with ring plover, colour ringing them to try and monitor and track their progress and their breeding site fidelity and so on. So you might see some colour ringed plovers around and about. But again, very endearing bird. And so during the summer, we'll have maybe 15 or 20 of them across the reserve. During the winter, we will get a couple of hundred. They come and birds from elsewhere come and spend the winter with us. Okay. So next one is a very obvious one, the lapwing. So it's obvious in a way that it makes itself obvious. So the lapwing nests all across the New Forest and across the Lymington Keyhaven marshes. As with the other waders, they're pretty rubbish. They make just a rough scrape on the ground, so they just pretty much dump their eggs on the ground. We get good numbers all across the reserve. And as with all of the ground nesting birds, they're very vulnerable to disturbance and they're quite stressy. And so they spend a lot of energy on defending their nest. making themselves trying to drive people or potential predators away. Um, numbers have declined hugely, and it's not just like with all of these things. And one of the things I wanted to stress in this talk is this these with issues with wildlife in particular, it's not ever black and white. There's a tendency for people to point a finger at things, but really it isn't that. There's a whole load of factors that come into play that have an impact on species. And one of the big things here with lapwing was the beast from the east that we had in 2017. That cold period of weather in April 2017 wiped out a lot of our lapwing across the south of the UK, and they're struggling to claw back from that. Their productivity is really poor. They're not getting very many young off. But they're an amazing bird. They're an entertaining bird. They're such a visible bird. And if you go around the marshes in the morning, a lot of them nest quite close to the sea wall. You'll notice, and so particularly around the lagoons that have got fences, and that's not just by accident. So they do that intentionally because what you know they see their main predators as gulls and birds of prey, and so what they do, they try to nest close to an obstacle like a fence, because that breaks up a potential attack from a bird of prey. So if a gull or a peregrine or a marsh harrier came swooping in, if there is an obstacle such as a fence in the way, it acts as a deterrent for that predator. And so that's why they nest close to the fences and therefore close to the sea wall. So one of the things you'll find is if you're out early in the morning, particularly if you're out early in the morning, sort of taking the dog for a walk, the lapwings all kick off because they get used to the quiet of the marshes. But during the course of the day, they get acclimatized to people walking along the sea wall. So generally ease off and settle down. But for the first few walkers, cyclists, joggers on the sea wall, they'll get all the attention of the lapwings, and it can be quite entertaining. They can be quite quite loud and raucous. Um, I'll play their call because they've got a lot of, like some of our birds, they have a lot of other sort of colloquial names. The lapwing's name is green plover or the peewit. I'll play the call and you see where that comes from. Oh, right. So I was taking a sip of tea. Um, so yes, that's lapwing. Next up, oh, there's a lapwing chick. I couldn't not show a picture of a lapwing chick. And it's not all bad news. So lapwings have had a tough time and they've had a tough few years. They're really struggling out in the New Forest. They're very vulnerable in the New Forest. But actually, on the coast this year, they've done a bit better. So we've had a slight upturn in numbers of lapwings surviving the breeding season. Um, So now we've got Avocet. So there's I think I've got 10 or 12 birds that I'm sort of highlighting here. So Avocet is a real conservation success story and is doing a lot of good around the marshes. It's a very obvious bird during the breeding season around the marshes. Um, like all the waders, as I said before, they have a pretty poor shallow scrape that they nest on the ground. Um, and they're here. The avocets are with us all year round, except for a little period of a few months in the autumn and early winter when they all go off to molt. So they have this strategy where they every year, feathered birds they go off and molt their feathers and replace their feathers. Different birds have different strategies to do that. Our avocets go and do it en masse. So most of our avocets we've found from bringing go to Poole Harbour, where there's literally hundreds, if not thousands, of avocet there, all molting at the same time. And the reason they do that is because they lose their flight feathers and regrow them. And during that period of regrowth, they either become flightless or lose their ability to be very effective at flying and makes them vulnerable to birds of prey. And so they have this strategy with safety in numbers. And so that's why our avocet disappear for a few months to go off and molt, and then they're just starting to come back now. So if you go for our head, there's for the past week or so, there's been maybe a dozen or so avocet hanging around. Those numbers will pick up quite quickly. But they're a success story. So since 2009, they started breeding. I remember, unfortunately, the first pair that bred on the marsh, their eggs got stolen. But that was really devastating at the time. But then in subsequent years, they've slowly taken hold, and now we've got probably about between 40 and 50 pairs across the marshes, and so it's a really good conservation success story. but they're really good parents, the avocets. And so if you're out and about in the summer and you're walking along and you hear a crow or a gull or a bird of prey, keep an eye out on the avocets because they go absolutely nuts. They're really good parents and they've got no fear. They'll drive off all sorts. Even, on the odd occasion we get an eagle fly over, the avocets have no fear. They'll tackle everything and anything. And so they're fantastic parents, but they're also good for the marshes. So they're benefiting our other species because the avocets are so aggressive and driving off the black-backed gulls and the crows and the ravens, that their actions are driving them off are benefiting other birds. In 2014, so yeah, 10 years, blimey, 10 years ago now, we did a colour ringing project on avocets with Graham Giddins up at Needsor. We've been asked to do that again this year. So RSPB are keen on us colour ringing some avocets on the marshes. So you might see through spring next year that there are some colour ringed birds. Just to look at where they're going, what their movements are, and also what we're really interested on is their dispersal. So when they breed, when the chicks hatch, if the chicks, we don't know with our birds on the marshes, if the chicks come back to breed in the area that they were essentially bred on, or whether they disperse to other parts now that the population's got to such a size. So we're keen to see where our young birds get to. So let's have a set. Oh, this is what you hear when they're driving off the gulls. Okay, so next up, curlew. So curlew, another high-profile bird locally, and quite rightfully so. So curlew, we've got about 40 pairs nesting in the New Forest, and some of those birds that nest in the New Forest will come and spend the winter with us on the marshes. Others will go further afield. But the marshes are actually really important for our wintering curlew as well. So we get up to, well, 300 or 400, sometimes some years even more, curlew coming and spending the winter with us. So it's actually nationally significant, the numbers of curlew we have. And curlews are another vulnerable species. They live a lifestyle relatively similar to the Brent geese. In fact, food is totally different. So they're foraging for invertebrates and the intertidal and in the muds. But at high tide, they'll move off into the inland fields, and so these areas that they escape to at high tide are just as important as the coastal marshes that we see them in during the day, or yeah, sort of generally when out and about. They're an iconic bird as well. I mean, for me, it's the sound of the New Forest. I'll play their song or their call, and it's just sort of like the call of wild places, really. Yeah, I could listen to that all day. But yeah, this is one that's of extreme concern because, as I said, we've got about 40 pairs nesting across the New Forest, but the productivity is horrendous, and we've had a slightly better year this year. But some years, those 40 pairs are producing only one or two youngsters amongst them, and so it's just not sustainable. And so, this if things continue as they are, we think in our generation, they will become extinct locally, as a breeding species, which is really quite tragic. And so there's a lot of work going on at the moment, and it's a complex thing. And like I said before, it's never black or white. There's lots of factors. There's lots of things. There's some things that are outside of our control. But there are things that are within our control. And one of the things within our control is managing that disturbance. And so it's really important for birds like curlews that we give them the space and the peace that they need, to live their lives. Oh, and next, a change. There's a bit of a change here. Little egret. So little egret is another success story. But the reason I mention little egret is because it kind of they kind of encompass how birds live their life a little bit. So we do a lot of study with little egret on the marshes because they're relatively new. They became extinct in the UK in the Victorian period because they're hunted for their feathers. They made a natural comeback in the mid 90s, and in the last 25 years, numbers have really grown on the marshes. They don't breed on the marsh, but they're there year round, because they don't get sexually um, active until they're about 2 or 3 years old, sexually mature until they're 2 or 3 years old, and so these young birds are on the marshes all year round. But these are birds that we encounter a lot. You can't go out for a walk on the seawall without seeing an egret. But they have quite a tough life because you'll see them feeding along. They'll feed quite close by. They'll they're quite approachable. They're quite bold, but they are easily disturbed. But when you see one fly off because it's been disturbed, often it has a bit of a quandary because what we don't see is that these birds are territorial. So they'll have their feeding spot, and often their feeding spots aren't very big. And so there might be a stretch of maybe 10, 20, 30 meters is their spot to feed in. And they'll defend that spot against all other little egrets. But the problem is, once a little egret gets pushed from that spot, then it's moving into other little egrets patches, and they get beaten up. It causes scraps. They get pushed around. These birds that get flushed out of their feeding spot you can see them get pushed around all over the place. Or if they're vulnerable to that, they'll just go and sit out on the marsh and just sit and wait until their feeding space is clear again. But they could leave it. They could leave it half an hour or an hour before they're up for returning after a disturbance event. And so, for us, as we're walking along and you see an egret get disturbed by whatever might have disturbed it, you just think, oh, it's just sort of flown off. But actually, for that bird, that's quite a big deal because it's that's going to stop it feeding for a period of time. And again, like all these things, they have quite a fast metabolism, and so they often need to be feeding all day in order to have the resources to survive the night. We when we're bird ringing, part of what we do is monitoring the fat and muscle levels of these birds, and more often than not, they have pretty much a zero fat and muscle score. They don't maintain, they don't build up fat and muscle because they're a bird. The more fat and muscle they have, the harder it is for them to fly. So they keep this really fine balance with not having much resource to make them light and agile, but the cost for that is that they need to be feeding all the time to maintain their energy levels. So anyway, long story cut short, the good success news story. The egrets, we monitor them. That picture, that central picture, is the roost. There's a roost on the marsh that I've been monitoring, and now with my son Jamie monitoring it since I think 2001. So it's we've got a good data set of how the numbers of egrets have changed on the marsh over the years. And then finally, final one, I think this is the final one of this little series, is the peregrine. So this is one that we don't often think of as a bird of the marshes, but it actually is. So we've got a couple of pairs of peregrine nesting on the ground. So when we think of peregrines, we normally think of them nesting in cathedrals or on cathedral spires or tall buildings, chimneys, that sort of thing. But we've got these weird peregrines on the marsh or in the Western Solent that actually nest on the ground, which makes them extremely vulnerable. And so these birds are all through the Western Solent. They can often be seen hunting over the reserve, but and returning to their nests on the ground. But it's another one just to be mindful of, really. We do quite a bit of work with the peregrines. We go out and ring them. We take DNA from them for their own security, because there's a bit of a black market trade in peregrines. So they all have their DNA taken and recorded, documented. But they are extremely vulnerable to disturbance, even though they are also a cause of disturbance, of course, as they're hunting across the reserve. Okay, so that's the birds, but I've been focusing on birds because that's the main focus of attention on the marshes. But also, you've got to nod to the other species that we've got out there, and some of it's obvious, some of it's not. But roe deer are pretty much ever present. They're across the marsh. You'd be surprised they're across the marsh quite a lot overnight. But they tend to rest up during the day in the fields. So we've got butterflies. It's lovely marbled white there, a species that's declined. Dragonflies, hairy dragonfly there. Mammals offshore, so it's common seal. We regularly get common seal and grey seal on the marshes, and reptiles as well. So I think 4 species of reptile frequently recorded across the reserve, and so there's that's a blackadder in that picture there. But yeah, a good mix of other species. And so that's the marshes. So that's all that I've been trying to basically sell the marshes and the wildlife of the marshes, and trying to sort of highlight, it's sort of personalize it a little bit, I suppose. Um, but and then recreation. So the theme of this talk, I'm obviously talking to NFDOG, and so the theme of this talk is about dog walking. But of course, we have to recognise that it's not just dog walking that's causing disturbance on the marshes. There's lots of disturbance from lots of quarters, and it would be remiss of me to not acknowledge that. We're all out on the marshes, whether you're a bird watcher, and that's the other thing as well. You see lots of photographers out on the marshes. Not all of the photographers are bird watchers, and not all of the bird watchers are photographers. And then you've got naturalists. A lot of the naturalists are out there looking at maybe the fungi or the flora, the insects, not just the birds. You've got kayaking, kite surfing, cycling, running, walking, and we all have our thing. And so what the point I'm trying to make is the marshes are important for all of us. And if you went to any one member of any of those groups of people that visit the marsh, it will be a special place for all of them, and we'll all care deeply about it, I'm sure, but have different angles that we care about, and different reasons. But I think in this modern world, there was a time back in the day where the natural world was all kept quite secretive and sort of behind closed doors. But I think now it's important that it's open. We share what we have, we share what we know, and we share these areas as well. These are important areas for all of us for a whole load of reasons. And I think that's my main point. Is I think you know we need to all kind of recognize that we're kind of all on the same side. We all care about this place and these places, the New Forest as a whole. And we're much stronger and much better working together towards protecting these spaces, rather than sort of bickering amongst ourselves. And it can be frustrating when you're out in the sea. Well, I know it could be frustrating if there's a cyclist or a bird watchers with their tripods across the path, or cameras or whatever. It's frustrating, but I think we all need to give each other a little bit more leeway. And that leads on to my next slide, really, is mental health. And so I think the marsh is a really important place for mental health. We know the outdoors are, and speaking personally, it is for me. It's somewhere that I go, not just to go bird watching, but if I need to clear my head, my default place is to go to the marshes. But I think as users, I think we have to recognise that other people are doing the same thing, but maybe doing it in a different way. And that when we're talking about dog walking on the marsh, I think that's something we probably need to recognize as dog walkers, is that not everybody enjoys our dogs. And so I think it's important that we keep them close under close control, and the potential stress that it can cause. And so an event where a dog might go chasing off after the birds in the water out of control can be stressful and can be quite catastrophic for the birds, but also for other bird watchers in the area. It can be quite a stressful experience, and that's when tensions run high. And I think we need to recognise that we need to all look out for each other, and try and work towards securing the future of this place, and the benefits for all of us. Yes, so that's mental health, but so impacts of disturbance. So there's the obvious. There's disturbance prevents the wildlife from feeding and resting. Probably one of the biggest impacts of that is dogs going into the water, I think. Now, there's a lot of work. I'll talk in a slide in a second. There's a lot of work going on about fencing off certain areas of the marsh, but it can't all be fenced off. And we can't fence off. We can't fence off the coast, the offshore side. And so we all have to be responsible with that, and it's recognize the impacts of a dog going into the water. It isn't just that short term, 30 seconds or whatever. That has a lasting impact on the birds using that area, probably for that tide cycle. And so that could make life and death differences to some of the species that are out there feeding. And that sounds dramatic, me saying that. Even me saying it to myself sounds dramatic, but in fact it is a reality. And we often find dead, starved birds along the coastline, particularly first thing in the morning, because they haven't made it through the night. Um, because not only does it stop them from feeding, but it causes them to burn excess energy by flying off, or reacting. There's a picture there by Christine of mute swans reacting to the dog at Cut Bridge there by Hurst. So yeah, that causes an awful lot of tension that then carries on as well. These just like us, they have a thought process. They think about things, and it has a lasting impact. If a dog's caused an issue, the next set of dog walkers, even if they're well behaved, will have an impact on, from the birds seeing them. Birds see these dogs as just a predator, essentially. Um, but it goes beyond that. As I say there in the text here, it increases the water turbidity, which has an impact on our invertebrates that are living within the water table. So that's particularly crucial in our lagoons. And so it's a particular problem. The lagoons getting disturbed. They've got quite a silty bottom. So as dogs go into water, and also ponds across the New Forest, it churns up the water, which has a lasting impact on things like dragonflies in particular. And then dog feces as well. So dog feces, this shouldn't be a thing that we're talking about. I don't think in this day and age we should all be picking up our poo. I'm sure everybody on this call is doing that, but I think it's on us to maybe, as responsible dog walkers, to point that out to people that aren't. Because I found I'm both dog walker and birder and ecologist, and if I'm out bird watching and I talk about somebody's dog pooing somewhere, tend to get shouted down. But as a dog walker, people tend to listen to me a bit more. So I think it's on us as dog walkers to try and influence those less responsible in our community to do the right thing and pick up feces. Because I'm also a dad, and I've got kids. They're a bit more grown up now, but back in the day, I used to encourage my kids to go rummaging around in the undergrowth. Uh, but your heart always sinks when they come back covered in dog poo. It's something that shouldn't be happening in this day and age. So yes, not only is there the obvious impacts, but it also impacts the soil and changes the pH of the soil, and changes the whole makeup of both the New Forest and the marshes. And so, um, yes, so that's impacts of disturbance. But as I say, there are lots of forms of disturbance across the marshes. Some of the high profile things that we've got at the moment are disturbance from aerial stuff. Both paragliders and also kite surfers are causing quite a fair amount of disturbance on some sections of the marsh on windy days. Drones aren't permitted on the marsh or across the New Forest for good reason, because they look like a bird of prey, and when they go up, they cause absolutely chaos with our particularly with our nesting birds, which can make them vulnerable. Foxes. So foxes is a natural predator, but we've got an artificially high population of foxes, largely down to the way that we deal with our waste in our neck of the woods. So foxes are a real problem, and litter and waste as well is another one, and that's sort of kind of high on my personal agenda. It drives me mad to see litter and waste out in the countryside, and so these are all things that we need to address. And so the point I'm making with this is, it's easy to fall into a mindset that, pointing your finger at one corner of society, but it's not. We're all of us together. We all have a responsibility, and we're honest with ourselves. We all wear different hats. Like me as a bird watcher, as a dog walker, as a dad. We all in at different times we're doing different things, and we have to try and just do our best for the wildlife. So I'm conscious of time, so I'm just going to talk about some of the initiatives that are taking place at the moment. So there's three main spheres. There's the Hampshire Countryside Service, so they're the land managers of the bit that we know of as the marshes. So they're doing a lot. They're putting signage out. They're trying to keep the signage fresh and trying to remind visitors, because I think at the moment I'm talking to mainly local people, but obviously we get a huge number of visitors as well, and so these signs are relevant for them. Fencing, you'll have noticed on Oxley Marsh, a whole load of new fencing has been put up, and there's plans, if funding allows, for more fencing to go up to protect areas of marshland just to keep dogs and people off as much as possible in areas. Why people would want to go across there, I don't know anyway, because it's wet and muddy and smelly. But there you go. So it's just to sort of reiterate that. And the Countryside Service does a lot of monitoring as well. We work very closely with the Countryside Service, doing a lot of survey work. So there's a lot of monitoring goes on, a lot of conservation work as well. There's a whole team of conservation volunteers that are out weekly doing jobs across the marsh. And then we've got the Hampshire and Isle of Wight Wildlife Trust. Now this is probably the biggest new thing that's been going on lately. Is they've set up a stakeholder working group. Now this is a group of people who have an interest in the marsh, from a whole different range of aspects. So we've got the council and river wardens and it's represented by all sides of society. I think NFDOG have a representative on there as well, and it's to look at what we can do. And so we've just got funding as a group to fund equipment for some volunteers who will be out this summer at Hurst and Keyhaven, talking to visitors about the sensitivity, largely around the focus at the moment is around ringed plover, so nesting birds, but all aspects of wildlife on the reserve. And it's going to pay for some new signage as well. And so watch this space. There's a lot happening, but it's quite early days. And then finally, we've got Bird Aware Solent. So Bird Aware Solent are an organisation based further east, but they're frequently found on the marshes. And again, they have rangers out in the field, particularly looking at recreation and trying to discuss and understand people's needs and to raise awareness of the fragile sort of balance that our wildlife has at the moment. So that's current initiatives, but then there's a lot more work going on in the background. And so I mean, I've listed just mainly the stuff that we do, but there is a lot of stuff going on. So there's behind the scenes, there's the Webb's count. So that's a monthly count that's been going on since the 1960s. The BBS, Breeding Bird Survey. We've been running the CES, which is a breeding that sees us out once a week through the summer, ringing common breeding birds to monitor their health and their movements. We do a lot with the breeding terns. So just today, I heard of one of our terns that moved off down into southern Europe. Looking at we're working with ring plover and avocet. There's a regular seabird census. We do work with breeding waders. We're also out at night, so we go out at night onto the marshes with thermal imaging to look at where birds are feeding at night. So by day they'll feed in some areas, by night they feed in completely different locations. When there's no people around, it's amazing where the birds get to, and the mammals as well. But we're out looking at particularly snipe and jack snipe, where they're feeding at night and what numbers. There's huge numbers. These birds are largely nocturnal, and particularly the snipe. There's quite large numbers out there. You wouldn't believe it because you don't see them during the day. The egrets, and then a relatively new organisation is Limbo, which is a group of bird watchers essentially, but they've started the Lymington Bird Observatory, and they're monitoring bird numbers across the reserve monthly, and they're doing a fantastic job keeping on top of the fluctuations of birds and how they move around the site, both within the site and beyond the site as well. So yeah, there's just to kind of highlight that there's a lot going on behind the scenes. So what can we do? So what can we do as dog walkers, as walkers, as joggers, cyclists? I think one of the things, like I said before, we can be mindful to other site users, because just that it's an important area for all of us, and no one of us is got any more right than anybody else to be there. It's an important site for everybody that treasures it. The key thing is not to allow our dogs to chase or disturb wildlife. And so the signage on the reserve is to keep dogs under close control and to keep them on footpaths. And that seems very sensible. If you have a dog that isn't very good at recall, then keep it on the lead in the sensitive areas, and please keep your dogs out of the water as much as possible, because that does cause the largest issues of disturbance. Always pick up after your dog, keep to the main footpaths. I mean, a lot of this is just common sense, really. But also, yeah, please be mindful that dogs aren't for everyone. I know people that their day is ruined if a dog comes up and jumps up at them because they're scared of them. Like some people are scared of spiders. Some people are scared of dogs, and it's surprising. There's rather a lot of people in that category, and so we have to be mindful of the impact that we have on other people when we're out and about as well. Um, so yeah, it's all mainly common sense, but it's all small stuff. We don't have to. I don't think we have to go out there and do some big life changing actions. But it's just small stuff. But these small stuff, if we do it consistently, I think it can make a massive difference, not only to our wildlife, but to the people that we share the marshes with as well. That's it. That's at the end of the talk. So yeah, thank you. Sorry, I thought there was another slide there. That's thrown me. But that's a nice picture of Hurst Castle there, taken from Keyhaven, from ID Point. Yeah, like I say, it's a wonderful place. And I'm sorry if I've overrun a little bit, but I'm happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you, Marcus. That was amazing. Do you know, as you were talking, a David Attenborough quote came into my head, and I had to have a quick Google on the side to read it. And it talks about it from a children perspective. And it says, if children grow up not knowing about nature and appreciating it, they will not understand it. And if they don't understand it, they won't protect it. And if they don't protect it, who will? And I think for me, that summed up your talk beautifully. I was smiling every time you mentioned one of the different birds. I felt like I really began to know them as the characters and appreciate them. And I think the more we understand these things, the more likely we are to, adapt and change our behaviour to protect them. So for me, that quote just summed it up beautifully. And yeah, it was fascinating. So I don't know if anyone has any questions. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Hello, can I ask a question? Hello.
Of course.
Yeah. Just to say, I live in the forest, fairly near a bog where curlews used to nest regularly, but year after year, every time they try and breed, corvids get them, and they surround them and swamp them, and I think just harry the parents probably to an early death, but certainly don't allow the chicks to develop. Is anything being done to keep the corvid population down in the New Forest?
There are certain measures in place in some parts across the forest. So there's a study at the moment looking at these different predation events, and with corvids and with foxes and other species as well. And so yes, there is a bit of management with them and monitoring alongside that to see what impact that has. But yes, I mean, corvids, carrion crows and ravens in particular are a potential nemesis for our ground nesting birds, certainly. So yes, short answer is yes, there's a bit of work taking place, but it's sort of still early days, really. So it's hard to say at this stage how that will pan out in the future. But certainly at the moment, there's work going on in sort of behind the scenes. So Forestry England and GWCT are doing a lot of work with that.
Thank you.
Thanks.